As I introduce our panelists, I'm going to ask them to go ahead and come up here, and so we can get started. Our first panelist will also serve as our moderator, Carol Singleton Slade. Carol started her career in technological exploration as a geophysicist, working with BP, Hess, and British Gas. She held a number of executive positions with ARCO in exploration, corporate strategy, and financial roles. She now leads the global energy practice for Egon Zehnder and also leads the company's board practice in the United States. She's a trusted advisor to global energy organizations at the board and in the C-suites, providing counsel on topics of succession planning and board effectiveness. Here in Houston, where she's based, she sits on the board of directors of Big Brothers Big Sisters Lone Star. Welcome to Carol. Our second panelist is Amy Nelson, president of Green Ridge Advisors, LLC, an energy services and equipment consulting firm which she founded in 2007. Her firm advises clients on strategic development, capital allocation, acquisition evaluation, and infrastructure development. Amy serves as a director of Apache Corporation, Enercorp Sand Solutions, and recently joined the board of directors of NACD Texas TriCities Chapter. She began her career with Amoco Production, our mutual alma mater, and spent 7 years with SCF Partners, an oil services-focused private equity firm. Welcome, Amy. Our third panelist, who's already been mentioned, is Dennis Wu, managing partner of Wu Hoover and Company, LLP, a professional CPA firm based in San Francisco. Early in his career, Dennis enjoyed 37 years with Deloitte & Touche. He's chair of the board of Recology and previously served on 2 NASDAQ-listed companies. He is chair of the San Francisco chapter of the Asian Pacific Islander American Public Affairs Association and a member of the board of directors of the Committee of 100, a national organization of prominent Chinese Americans. He is currently chair of the NACD Northern California chapter. Welcome, Dennis. Last night, we had a wonderful speaker dinner hosted by Abernathy McGregor. And if it was any indication of what you're about to witness, I think this is going to be one of the liveliest conversations you've ever had. So let's go ahead and get on with the show. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Anna, for the wonderful introductions, and welcome, Amy and Dennis, and thanks to you all. You're going to hear quite a bit about our panelists here and get to know them, and our plan is to really give you the perspective of what boards are looking for, how they go about it, in particular around diversity additions to their board. But we thought, well, you're going to get to know us a lot better, and we'd quite like to get to know you a little bit better as well, know who our audience are. So first of all, we're going to have a show of hands of those of you who are current active executives. And then can I have a show of hands of people who are on a non-profit board currently? And also we have a show of hands of people who are on a for-profit board. Excellent. And a show of hands of people who want to be on a for-profit board. Excellent. So I think our news today is we're going to share some good news with you and maybe share some not so good news because we always need to do better, of course. But you'll see in your pack there's actually some data that was from a global diversity survey that was actually done in 2016. There's going to be a new one coming out in 2018. And at the time, the not so good news was the US was actually declining in terms of its diversity board placements. But happy to say that in 2017, in the US, actually 38% of the new seats in the US went to females. So we're actually turning the trend around. And so now in the F100, 24% of board directors are now women. And there are only 2 Fortune 100 companies that don't have women on their builds. So some good news there, but again, we need to do better. But what I want to do first is, Amy, I guess it was about 4.5 years ago, there was a change, or refreshment, if you like, that has been ongoing in the Apache board. And I just wanted to get your perspective, given that you're now a part of it, you're one of 2 women on the board of Apache. Tell us a little bit about that story.
Well, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Apache Corporation, but it is an independent E&P company headquartered here in Houston. And it had been had a strategy that was very successful for many years, and they outgrew that strategy. And they shifted strategy. At the same time, there was also a shift in management, executive management, and they went about a corresponding shift in the board. And so over the period of 5 years, really 4 years, from 2013 through 2017, 2/3 of the board members of Apache changed over and were refreshed. And it dramatically changed when the skill set that was on the board, the tenure, and the age, and then also the gender diversity. And Apache went about it in a very thoughtful manner in terms of how they were adding. And in fact, if you start from 2013, the first 3 board members that changed, 2 of the 3 were women.
So Dennis, talk about the Recology board, because I think you have a story to tell about what diversity truly means with respect to that board.
So Recology is a $1 billion company. We're an ESOP, 100% owned by employees. Not being an employee, I don't have a share of stock. Today, we have 2 women on our board. We have 2 Asians. We have 1 African American. We have a Latina. We have a gay person. We have a lesbian. And we have a Jewish member of the Jewish faith. Our members have different backgrounds. We have someone that had worked as CEO of Goodwill in the Greater Bay Area for probably, I think, 7-8 years. We have someone who had spent 20-some years as an executive for an insurance brokerage firm. Did I mention that we had an African American on the board? He's was the CFO of AAA Insurance Company in Northern California. I have an accounting background, and I was CFO for a few years. We have an architect on our board, and that's important to us because we're doing a lot of construction. San Francisco has a mandate towards zero waste. That basically means that we're doing everything we can to totally minimize the amount of material we send to the landfill. We do a lot of recycling, we do a lot of composing, and we do a lot of diversion. And so our architect has been quite helpful in that area. When I took over as chair, a number of these folks joined the board, and each of them chairs a committee. We actually created an innovation committee because, as you know, in the Bay Area, everyone talks about the Uber effect or the Lyft effect. What is going to be the disruption that's going to totally change your industry? And so our concern was, what's going to happen in the waste management business that's could totally change what we're doing? And so the woman who leads who used to be with Goodwill, we actually created an innovation committee, and we probably, among the very, very few companies I know of, actually has a board committee that has this innovation committee. And we typically try to have 2 or 3 independent board members on a committee. every single board member wanted to be on the innovation committee. And that particular committee, not only do we have board engagement, we have our employees engaged in it. They've gone through programs, thinking out of the box, thinking innovatively. Because of the concern that we have about disruption and risk, we have created a risk management committee, and that's led by the individual that has been an executive as an insurance broker. And we brought in a gentleman who actually is quite well known in NACD. He's the chair, I believe, of the commission that's going to be putting out some material at the Global Summit this year on risk oversight. And so James Lamb has been now working with us for about 6+ months, and in fact, every board member is going to go through about a 4-hour training session, because we believe that risk and managing risk is very, very critical.
Yeah, this is excellent, and I think what you're saying, Dennis, is diversity is a big issue, of course, but it's more around an organisation really thinking about its own future strategic direction. So I'd like to ask both of you, because we certainly work with boards in this regard, kind of helping them to think through. It's not just finding a director for now, it's finding a director for the future and the value that they're going to bring. So in your minds, it's normally led by nomination committee, right? How can the nomination committee, how can they be more proactive, I think, in shaping the board portfolio, if you like, in terms of directors, so it's more in line with the strategic direction of the company? I'll go to you, Amy.
I think that the Nominating and Governance Committee, first and foremost, has to consistently be looking at what is the strategy going forward,
Absolutely.
What are the associated risks, and what does that mean from a skill set perspective, and then overlaying that with the skills matrix for their existing board, and seeing where there's gaps and where they may have some redundancy that they may need if they're not going to expand the board. They may need to fill by asking someone else to leave. And so, but you have to be diligent and you have to be open and honest about what skills each board member brings and what skills you really need going forward based on what is the strategy and what are the risks. And if it's just a once a year check the box activity that the board's going to do, you're not going to get very far. But again, if it's something that you're touching on at every meeting and you're having active dialogue, then you can then start to pursue making sure that you're identifying and filling those gaps.
And what would you think, Dennis? I mean, I think that would be best practice. The question is, how often is that actually happening? But what are your thoughts, the role of the nomination committee?
Yeah, I don't think it's the job just for the nomination committee. I think it's a responsibility of everybody. And when I say everybody, I'm talking about everybody, including the employees. Thinking about, I mentioned earlier that we're an ESOP. And with an ESOP, there's an administrative committee made up of the owners who sort of provide oversight over the board. It's a funny relationship. We nominate them and we reappoint them. They, in turn, once a year, approve our continuing on the board. And this year, every year we go through a review with our outside counsel. And every few years, in this year in particular, they actually sat down for at least an hour interviewing every single board member. And while we've been thinking about certain things that we need on the board, one of the messages that came out very clearly from them is that we need to have somebody on our board who's got technology experience. And so what I was very, very proud of is that this basically came from the employees, thinking about what the company needs. That what we've been doing with innovation has brought them to the point where they're recognizing what we're needing in the leadership and on the board, and feeling that having an outsider with expertise in that area is something that's going to enhance the organization. So Any number of us are out there looking. I mean, I personally have identified 2 individuals actually at NACD events. They happen to be women. They happen to be minorities. In each case, I introduced them to the CEO. One case, we had lunch. In another case, this individual spoke at one of our meetings, and I called him up next morning and says, Mike, you've got to come and listen to this individual. So he joined the meeting the next evening, and we actually had dinner with her. So it is, as I said, the ideal situation is to be able to change the culture so everyone in the company is thinking about what's best for the company and not being shy about speaking up and speaking their mind.
I think there are 2 interesting points. I'm going to ask you something in a minute, but I wonder how many of our public board members would like to be assessed every year by their employee base. I don't think there'd be many show of hands on there, but I mean, certainly, I mean, it's interesting. I'm spending quite a bit of time in Europe and comparing and contrasting, of course, with the US, and actually the whole board review by independent parties is much more prevalent. We as a firm do a lot more what we called board effectiveness review in Europe than here, although it is starting to grow here, and certainly it seems to be a vehicle to kind of keep that alive. But you also mentioned something else about bringing potential directors to the attention of the board because of someone that you've known. It'd be nice to hear your story, Amy, on why you joined the Apache board.
Why I joined the Apache board?
Well, one of the reasons.
I was attracted to the Apache because it was a company in transition.
Yeah.
And so there's an opportunity where you feel you can actually help make a difference.
Right.
And be involved in and help a company navigate some difficult waters. And so that was what attracted me to Apache. That and the historical reputation of the company in terms of kind of being big bad Apache, right? Just in terms of how well they grew, and for all of you who worked in companies where Apache bought your kind of tail assets and then kind of embarrassed you by how well they developed them, you did gain a respect for what the company had accomplished.
But I think one of the things we were talking about last night was that there were a number of members of the board who had actually obviously knew of you by reputation.
I see what you're getting at. Yeah. So the question is how was I able to join the Apache board? I don't have a very traditional public company kind of board background, and first of all, the board was able to look at a skill set away from just what your title or my role might have been, which was important. But really what's important is you have to have a network. Mm-hmm. You have to be known by somebody. Almost all companies hire someone that they've had some exposure or experience with when they're filling a role, mm-hmm. right? Even companies, when they're hiring off the campus, they have summer internships so they can see and get to know the individual before they extend an offer. The same holds true with the board. They want to know how you work, what you accomplish. Are you going to fit in culturally with the board, and are you going to have a positive impact? And so you have to know someone. You have to know someone on the board or someone within their kind of sphere, industry sphere and group, and or know the search firm that's leading the search for the board member, so that they can give a very personal voiceover to your resume as to why you would fit on this board.
It's a very,
and so
very
it's really is a who you know.
And it really is key, because I can say a couple of things. One is, we'll go through a huge exercise around thinking through the strategy and the types of skills, experience, culture fit people need. And then the board, and we'll have a long list, we'll go through it all, and the board will say, oh, but what about so-and-so, who is totally off spec, but the board members know, and they really recognize that it's a strong fit. And we've done this with, very, very large boards where, really we're looking at the biggest CEOs in the Fortune 100 as potential board members, and they'll dismiss them if someone is not known by at least one member of their board. So we cannot say enough, I think, right, that having connection and making sure that you do have, you do network at the board level. And the nice thing is that the board, once you're connected in the board level, it kind of snowballs, right, because everyone is connected to everyone else. So it's not, don't think of it as being daunting, but it is very critical.
I've been working on the diversity area for many, many years, and my heart goes out to a lot of people who are trying to get on boards. And I've been thinking for a while now, why do some people get on boards, and why do some people seem to have great difficulty? Mm-hmm. It's not like going to college and getting an MBA, and then, after you get that, then you go to a placement center, and you get interviewed, and you get a job. The relationships and the prior contacts are important. People having had an opportunity to see you in action. I'll share with you my Recology story. I actually, when I was at Deloitte, was hustling the CEO as a potential client. And I invited him to a dinner that the San Francisco AIDS Foundation put on. AIDS was at the beginning, early years of the AIDS epidemic. And I had gotten my managing partner at Deloitte to agree to allow us to do pro bono audits for a number of AIDS organizations. And so Mike Sangiacomo, the CEO, attended my guest. I reached out to him. And interestingly enough, at dinner, he made the comment, I really want to go on that board. And being somebody who wanted to, get on his best side, I worked hard to try to get him on the board. And it turned out that my best friend actually was on the board. And the gay community was suspicious because they were primarily the folks on the board about his motives, because there was an election coming up having to do with whether or not the company was going to be able to keep its exclusive license. He got onto that board. From there, he became chairman of the chamber board. I never got the account. A number of years later, I get this phone call, and he and I were laughing about as to who got who. And I got a call and said, I'd like to talk to you about joining our board. And so, it's kind of a turnaround situation. But the lawyer at that time, the corporate lawyer at that time, was also someone who knew me, and he knew me because of the years that we worked together in the Schwab account. I was the partner in Schwab for 22 years, and so he had the opportunity to see me in action. So that's how I ended up getting on that board, and 5 years later I became chairman. But I will tell you, I talked about the people that joined our board, and we used a search firm to help us. Every single one of the people who came on our board, it's really a diverse group. I mean, I would match our board up against anybody else's board in terms of just diversity of talent and gender and, racial, you name it, we've got it. But every one of those members, somehow or other, we knew something about them. The African-American CFO that we brought in, I must have met him maybe 10 years earlier when he first came into town. And my best friend who had recruited him from New York invited me to dinner, and that's how I got to know Michael. The CEO of Goodwill, it's a well-known organization. But she and our CEO were both on the AIDS Foundation. The executive, Larry, who is now leading our risk oversight, he and Mike also met at the AIDS Foundation and got to know each other. The architect, Sylvia, was president of the San Francisco Chamber of Commerce at one time. In fact, 2 years before Mike Sangiacomo, the CEO, became. And that's how they got to know, they knew each other. And they had a chance to see each other in action. And, getting on a board is a little different than just applying for a job. You apply for a job. If you don't work out, it's, letting you go or you're finding something else. It's a lot easier than once you get on a board. And I think that people who are looking for a new board member are a lot more choosy about who they're going to let in. And I've actually commented in the past to others that it may be more similar to dating and these organizations where they do matchmaking, because you're in effect inviting someone into some, like a inner club, private club. And I made a comment last night that right, wrong, otherwise, the big public company boards are basically controlled mostly by a bunch of white male. Now, on the bigger companies you think about, many of the same white males belong to exclusively white male golf clubs, or they belong to some other organization. In San Francisco, we have an organization called the Bohemian Club. I mean, you can't get in there unless your father registered you when you were 10 years old or something. Right? And they go out to some camp someplace and do their thing, but it's all guys. Okay? Now, what chances do other people, and they're basically white guys, it's much harder if you're not running around in that crowd. And funny thing is many of these guys know each other. Just like I mentioned about the connection of my board through the AIDS Foundation or some other organization. These guys play golf together, right? They go to the Bohemian Club together. And so the challenge is, how do we crack that?
Well, I hope if you didn't think so before, building relationships, as you can see, is really important.
Some of it is changing the structure and the thought process. People say it's like a marriage, right?
Yeah.
And getting on a board, right? And it's really hard to get divorced. And I think you have to move the mindset, if we want to have an analogy, instead of marriage and divorce. How many of you guys remember Bull Durham from like the 90s? Okay. You think of it as Susan Sarandon's character, serial monogamy, right? You have to think about it as you're not like cemented in on this board and people are cemented in there forever and tenure goes on. It's really, you're there, you're engaged, you love that company, that board, you're adding some sort of value on that board, and then it's time to move on. Yeah. And find the next love.
We see this too many times, I mean, I hate to say this, but the US is behind in terms of its approach and it's this whole stigma, if you like, of going on a board and never coming off, the white knuckles. And of course, the US, I don't know, is ever going to adopt tenure. There's kind of a gasp when everyone mentions the word, but in other countries, and particularly, the UK, for example, where, 9 to 10 years, it's deemed that you're no longer independent, and it's not a rule. It's that then people are going to start to ask questions. Is this director independent? So there's a natural kind of turnover that happens, and that obviously gives you room to actually bring in diversity, right? Because if you don't have the spaces, how are you going to do it? But it's even more than that. I mean, I don't know if the UK is so good at this, but in broader Europe, you're actually seeing many people who are on a board for 3 years or 6 years, and they say, well, I don't quite fit with this anymore, and I think it's time for me to go to it. Yeah, and that should be healthy, not this, if I'm off a board, then it's, it's a really bad omen for me.
What did you do?
Yes, what did you do? So Susan was saying there's all the great things about having women on your board. I mean, including the financial impact, of course, and yet we still don't have. If the goal is parity, then it's going to take us, I think, until I think it's 2036 or something like that to even get close. And certainly in the US, we had a nice growth last year, which is great, but it hasn't been great in the years before. So what do you think is really stopping boards potentially from adding women?
Do you want me to dive in?
Yeah, dive in, Amy.
To me, it falls into, call it 3 categories. One, structural. We talked about tenure. That's part of it. Call it, the board game of Twister, if you want. You're looking at your skills matrix, and you're trying to figure out what skills you need. You're trying to manage the tenure, or the range of tenure on your board, the age, average age and age span on your board, gender. Then you're trying to look at who you can get and who you can't get in terms of kind of negative covenants out there, in terms of, the person can't be overboarded because you want to make sure they have time for your board. They can't be a competitor. They can't be a major supplier. They can't be what we refer to as past their sell-by date, right? You've been retired for so long, you're not relevant anymore. And so, you have all these things that you're trying to manage to fill out the board, and then adding on culture issues on top of it, that I think that can be hard. And what are you prioritizing? And how do you get those puzzle pieces all to fit? Or in the game of Twister, how do you bend to make it work? So there's the structural issues. Then there is, what skills are you prioritizing? And if your main skill is that you want is that they've been a public company CEO, you're not going to have a lot of diversity. So it's really, what are you prioritizing, and how are you looking at skills beyond just the role that they were in? And then the third issue is human nature. It goes back to what we first talked about, which is human nature is you hire somebody you know. So you have to be known. And the second issue is, as somebody referred to me, is really hard to overcome, is if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So if you perceive your board to be operating well and the company is operating well, performing well, why rock the boat? And so I think those are kind of the 3 kind of main categories that may be prohibiting it. And just the sheer fact that there's not that many seats that turn over every year.
No, absolutely.
So there were 358 seats filled in the S&P 500 or whatever, right? Last year. Mm-hmm. That's,
it's not so many.
That's not so many when you say, okay, that was 7.5% of the total number of seats. Mm. So you're not going to make, it's hard to make significant strides very quickly.
I don't know how easily, getting boards to turn over is going to happen. You can't mandate it, or I guess you could. I mean, in Europe, there's some mandates in terms of percentages. I don't think that's part of our culture. I mean, my only thought is that if you want to get on a board, you need to have more programs in which you got the gatekeepers there. And if you don't invite the gatekeepers, meaning the white, male, older guys, it's not going to change. I mean, I was with Deloitte when we woke up one day and realized that we had a serious problem with the retention of women. We spent $6 million to learn what we were doing wrong. And we ran every single partner and manager through 2-day training in those days on getting us to understand that we had built-in prejudices, biases. And I think that unless there's a change in the mentality of companies, it's not going to be that easy to change. I mean, people are going to get it, and there are going to be people who want to, but again, it's at comfort level, and my encouragement is if you want to get in, then you need to make more of an effort to go to events and programs where these guys are going to be at, and get to know them and let them to get to know you. You know, I'll say one thing that I'm really happy about with respect to Recology. Being a waste management company, you can imagine that, we were started by a bunch of Italian immigrants. And you would normally think of it as a male-dominated organization. And yes, that's true with respect to the truck drivers. They're very unionized, and that is predominantly men because there's a certain amount of heavy lifting, even though we have a lot of equipment today. But when it comes to the office positions and comes to management, we got almost 50% women in our office jobs. We're making some good strides in a management level. I think we're probably up there about 38% But the one thing I'm very, very proud of is that we have 5 people in our C-suites. We have 3 white male right now. We have a general counsel who's Asian. And we have a woman who's the head of HR, who's a member of that group. And more importantly than that, she's the newly elected chair of the ESOP Administrative Committee. That's a very powerful position. And it's a younger woman. Our CFO is retiring at the end of December. We have just hired a woman CFO. Now, that didn't happen by accident. Our CEO had said a number of years ago, when Mark retires, I really would like to see a woman in this position. And so when we engaged an HR firm, we said, right, this is our priority, ideally, all things being equal. Culture was very, very important to us. Out of the whole group of people, I think they interviewed 2 men, one of whom was a racial minority. But the woman that we ended up hiring, imagine, if you will, how many people are there out there who understand the waste management industry and understands ESOPs? Funny thing, she didn't need either one of those. But culturally, she fit very, very, very well. And that was really the important factor. And cultural fit is critically important.
So of course, we need to encourage more and more women executives. I mean, they're the lifeblood, if you like, of the board members. So I applaud you for everything you're doing there. I can say that the good news is that out of all the board work that I'm doing now, I would say 80 to 90% are diversity-focused searches, which I think is fantastic. But I can also tell you that here in the US, along with, and this is just within Aegon Zender and in my colleagues, that we're all chasing the same women. And so we have to be really careful because we're tripping over each other. So what are we looking for? I thought it'd be helpful to share some of that because we truly are doing this, and because a lot of boards are asking for, well, if it's a QFE, a qualified financial expert, of course it's a CFO, and it's devilishly hard to find a female CFO who isn't already boarded up, of course. So that speaks for itself. But a lot of the board work we're doing now is looking for women who have had real P&L responsibility. And so we're actually drilling deep. I mean, it's often a board will say, well, we need board experience. If they're not a CEO, then we need board experience. And of course, we're not going to get that with females. And so boards are becoming much more open about the fact that this may be someone's first board seat, right? But it means we're going deeper into the organisation. Even then, we're running into women who may already have a board, or we're calling them, and then a colleague down the street wants to call them as well. So those, the QFE, the P&L, those are things that are really top of mind. But having the board experience and even having the CEO, I think that's it's now not becoming one of the key criteria, which is great.
But I think that if you got an open mind about what you're looking for and you find that right cultural fit, you'd be amazed at how we can rationalize and say, you know what, we can make this one work.
Right. And someone has asked about smaller companies, but also private companies, and you're going to talk about this as well, because what we're seeing in the private equity world is a huge increase in demand for people to come on as board members for their portfolio companies, and not just pre-IPO. This is, quite a bit before, so they can add, independent thought. So Amy, you know that kind of world pretty well.
Right. I just joined a board. That's a private equity-backed company. And so, that is a great opportunity to get on a board, on a for-profit board. That is becoming more pervasive, although I was sitting on some that I wasn't even an investor, the private equity company investor in, 10 years ago. But it's becoming more common. It is a great stepping stone. It does show that you know how to operate on a board, although, as we were talking about, the old adage of boards is, nose in, hands out. On a board, and on a private company board, often, your nose in, hands in, elbows, feet, everything in, often on a private company board. So there's a slightly different cadence to it, but it is a great opportunity to get the experience at a board level.
So a couple of things. We're talking to a couple of really huge private equity entities who are looking for relationships so they can fill their whole, and these are organizations with literally hundreds, if not more, portfolio companies. And someone's asked a question about the value of non-profit. One thing I can say that if you've been on a private equity board that is private, but still for profit, that experience in terms of how we would see you from a search world would be extremely valuable relative to non-profit.
Yeah, and both of them work with capital allocation, but you're really looking at driving to the financial aspect of it.
But and Dennis, you may have some thoughts around this as we're delving deep into finding women who are more junior in their career. So I'm working with a board at the moment who are very specific about diversity. They want someone outside of their sector, maybe with a technology type of background, between the ages of 45 and 55. So really going relatively young. And then of course we're going to bring them on, and they're not going to have the same level of board experience, right? So where is the responsibility for ensuring that as we bring these great women on with great cultural fit, that they're going to be able to integrate effectively into the board?
I think that's the responsibility of the chair and other board members. If that's what you want to do, then you need to mentor them. You need to give them responsible positions. I mentioned earlier when we brought in our new board members, everybody who was brought in as chair of a committee, and we actually had I think a whole day and a half of orientation. We had folks in management that came in and reported about what they were shared with them, what they did, what was important, what were the issues that they were concerned about moving. And if you don't do that orientation, you're really putting any new board member at a disadvantage. So I think enlightened companies, when you make that investment of bringing somebody in, you need to also make the investment of really giving them the orientation and mentoring them.
Mm-hmm. And Amy, you joining Apache, did you have a good buddy to help you?
Well, there was so much change on the board that there were relatively new members at the same time. So it was very easy for me to look over to a colleague and say, did you get that? Did you understand that the way I did? Is this, and so that's very helpful. But what I will say is it was also helpful to be able to ask for and receive feedback. Some of it is you have to take ownership and responsibility too, and you need to go to one of the more tenured directors or leaders on the board and ask for candid feedback, because sometimes it is challenging, and I know I struggled with it and still to this day have to work at delivery, the timing, what you say, and not just what you say, but it's how you say it and when you say it. on a board. And so, getting feedback so that you're continuing to develop and make sure that you're integrating. It's not just the board's responsibility to make sure the new person integrates. It's a two-way street.
Certainly, I was talking to a chairman of a large board just a couple of weeks ago, and they were very excited about their new female woman who is in her early 40s who joined the board. But he realised that as chairman, it was his responsibility to actually coach and mentor. Which I thought was great, but maybe back to you, Amy. Well, actually both of you. I mean, as a diverse person on a board, do you think there's an added responsibility that you have in terms of, well, one, integrating when a new board member comes, but also thinking about bringing other diverse members to the board?
You want to field it first?
Well, I always like to get the most I can get. So getting a 3-fer for me is a lot better than a 2-fer or a 1-fer, right? So while we're out there looking at potential board members in technology, I'm aiming for 3-fer. If I get a woman, if I can get someone technology specialist that keep people happy, I can get a woman. I can get someone of a minority race. Wow. I'm in big heaven,
And to that point, everybody should be a 2-fer.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're on a board because you're the diversity candidate and solely because you're the diversity candidate, you have a problem. One, from a board culture perspective, and two, from the what are you doing there? What are you adding perspective? So you should always, first and foremost, be checking a skill set.
Absolutely.
On the matrix. And then to that point, as a diversity candidate, what do you do? How can you best kind of support continued diversity efforts? And that's to be a contributing member of the board, right? Actions speak louder than words, or color, or gender. What are you bringing to the board? Are you engaged? Are you active? Are you thoughtful in what you're doing on the board? That's the first thing that you do. And then secondly, it is asking the questions. And there were some folks at dinner last night that said it better than I can, which is just making sure you're asking the questions when you are looking for board members. Do we have candidates? Are we looking at candidates? How are we asking for candidates? Where are we looking for candidates? Are we keeping our, what's the scope that's been given to the search firm for the candidate? And, sometimes if you're looking for, say, even just cognitive diversity, you got to step out of if we're in the EMP world, right? I need an EMP industry person. Well, you're going to probably have a lot of the same thought processes. So do you step out of that and you look at other industries? And that's part of what you have to task the search firm with, and agree as a board what you're going to be pursuing. And that's back, Dennis, earlier you made the point you didn't think it was nom-gov, but like anything, you try and get 10 people to do something, it's challenging. And so a lot of the more heavy lifting and initial work has to be done within the committee, and then you bring it for further dialogue and discussion and agreement, I think, at the broader board. But
so I come from San Francisco, and for those of you who are basketball fans, we have a team called the Warriors, and these guys like each other. And when we got Kevin Durant, our 4 best players went there together, holding hands. Right? So I really firmly believe, whether it's a board, a team, or anything else, people have to genuinely like to work together, and they need to bring different skills, and you admire and respect the different skill that they bring. And you will not be able, an existing board will not be able to attract good candidates if they're dysfunctional. Right? They have to, people, are going to want to join an organization that people care about each other. And you can see the magic when people care about each other. And that's what I always relate back to. And I said, look at what happened with the Warriors. How in the world did they, I have a 14-year-old son, I keep saying, how in the world did they get them? Well, they went in there and they said it was kumbaya. They were holding hands, they were dancing, they were, And Kevin says, I want to be part of this.
Yeah. Although someone has asked a question about addressing underperformers on the board, and maybe that is dysfunctionality as well. And unfortunately, and often when we are brought in to review the board, I mean, there is an element of dysfunctionality that the board hasn't addressed, quite frankly. So what are your thoughts on that? I mean, how can we help boards so they can sing Kumbaya and address the issues they have?
You just have to have that very candid discussion with a non-performer and tell them how they're not performing. And if they can't do something about that, then it's time for them to, find another board to be a part of.
And I think this goes back to your comment about the white knuckle. You're in the seat until death, right? If you have more turn on a board, and across boards in general, there's less stigma about leaving a board after a relatively short tenure, or even a relatively long tenure. So I think that helps. While it doesn't help protect against, say, activism, having a non-staggered board, having everybody up for election every year, does promote an easier exit. Otherwise, a lot of times, I think companies wait until the 3-year term is up and then say them go. Well, then they're sitting in a seat for 2 years because somebody wasn't willing to have that hard conversation because the optics didn't look great leaving in the middle of their term. But I think you do have to have a culture on the board that is very open, that does do reviews annually, whether or not it is done by a third party or is done in-house, to really bring those topics up and have them discussed with the individual board member, so when they are asked to leave, it's not a surprise. It's just like you're having an annual review at your office. Most people are used to having that, right? You need to have that at the board level as well.
Let's talk a little bit about activism, because we talked about in the UK where there's kind of this pressure, a lot of looking at you if you're overboarded or you're getting to that 9-10 years, and maybe it's activism here in the US. If I think about, there's lots of positives and not so positive things about activism. Most boards want to avoid it, of course, but if you think about the fact that they've actually released seats that maybe wouldn't have been released, that's maybe not a bad thing.
I don't think activism is necessarily a bad thing, because in some cases they've done some very positive things. In other cases, it's also pure greed on their part. They're pushing because they would like the stock price to go up. And it's not always because it's for the good of the company, it's more good for their own pocketbook.
But I can tell you, I'm doing a board search at the moment where we have a short list of candidates, and the chairman is actually vetting them with a pseudo-activist to see whether would this cause an alarm, or would it actually satisfy the activists? So they're actually really thinking about it in terms of.
Activists in their stock currently, or just asking a third party, a non-involved activist?
I think it's a third party.
Okay.
But one of the questions was asked, well, if it is important to kind of think about that and think about how to deal, with the activist piece, and think about what that means in terms of your, who you're going to invite on the board. Is it important to have, a specialist, say in PR, on your board? So I'll answer that question first, but then it brings into a whole question around, we talked about the fact that many of the board searches we're looking at the moment, it's P&L or it's CFO, that type of thing. What about experts? But we'll talk about that in a minute. But what about, having a PR person on your board? Have you thought about that?
Go for it.
I mean, I thought about it, and I've concluded that of all the various things that we need, we can hire the PR person. I do think that every company should have a PR firm that they've already identified. We've had a program on crisis response, and when you have a crisis and you need to respond to it, that is not the time to be trying to identify a PR firm or forensic firm or law firm, because if you got a good law firm working with you, they're going to want to get them to sign off some long, extensive contracts, and they're going to be negotiating. And, you know, every hour lost doing that instead of focusing on the crisis makes the situation significantly worse. And so I am a firm believer that you need to have vetted the PR firm. You need to know who it is. You need to be comfortable with them. It's like, you know, having a good doctor. You got to know who it is that you can pick up the phone and says, hey, we got a problem.
I would say on the PR, the initial responses, you can hire it out. But more generally, I would say, if that's all they're offering. You know, we're big proponents of we don't hire single issue board members. If you did that, your board would be unmanageably large. Okay, I was at a shareholder meeting. Our company and board is great, and we engage with shareholders as board members quite frequently. And I was asked, you know, who is your methane emissions expert on the board? Everybody has, you know, thankfully I could actually say, well, I actually read the 600 and odd page, you know, amendment that had come out. This was a couple of years ago, but I'm not an expert, right? The expertise is in the company. You know, the board needs to know enough to ask the right questions and make sure that the company is addressing the right issues. So for that, you want somebody to be broadly. It's great if somebody has PR experience, but what else are they bringing to the table?
Yeah.
And you know, interesting, when you were asking about the activists, I had a dinner a couple months ago with a group of activist shareholders. And one of the things that surprised, they did not think that there were enough folks with a private equity background on boards. Because their view was that you deal with capital allocation.
Right.
With a laser focus in private equity. And so I thought that was interesting, that was one of the things that they were wanting to see on boards.
So we're coming to a close. I'm disappointed to say, because it's been an amazing discussion. But one of the things I'd just like to ask as a passing point is, if we really do, or you all want, you know, parity on boards, and if you could take away any of the barriers, any of the kind of cultural issues or whatever, and put in place something that would really accelerate this, what would be your ideas?
I will say that two ways you can possibly do that, that I've heard and or experienced, and I'll leave it at that, is that one, you can ask a search firm when you're looking to fill a gap in your board matrix for only a list of diverse candidates. Get a long list of the diverse candidates, go through all of that, and then you can say, great, add some of the non-diverse candidates to the pool now. But what you don't want to start with is a list that has 1 or 2 diverse candidates and 20 non-diverse, right? Try and get a broad list. And then the second thing is you can say the names that go from the long list to the short list for interview, we have to have at least 1 diverse candidate. You have to at least talk to one of them. And that is a way to, I think, get more folks in the pipeline. Now the question is whether or not that's going to promote getting them, you know, the next step of getting on the boards.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have any thoughts, Dennis.
Well, actually on that, I mean, when I'm working with boards and they want diversity, I say only diversity. and then just don't even open up the door, and then we'll find someone.
I think that you have to have a change in attitude, and you've got to feel it within yourself that this is what you want to do. I'll go back to my Deloitte experience. When we realized that we were underrepresented in women and we had trouble keeping them, a time came when we all realized that if we wanted to achieve our goals, some of the white male had to be prepared to step aside and give the jobs to younger women. And we did that. And we understood that that was what we had to do the right thing. And so until companies reach the point where they understand that women are 50% of the population, that's the right thing to do. The sales point for us, and the gender issue is really an easier issue to deal with than when you start dealing with racial minorities. Because for us, the way it was pitched is, no matter who or what it is, every man has had a woman in his life, whether it's a mother, a wife, a daughter. For sure, he had to have a mother. Right? So unless they had a bad relationship. So that was an easier sell when we were able to say, look, you guys, and this data is not good. We haven't been doing right. And I think that when it comes to boards, ultimately, it is a matter of preaching that and getting people to nod their heads and say, yeah, you got a point. That when they start thinking that, gee, I got this wonderful daughter or daughters, and they can't get on boards, and then having these men do something about it. I mean, that's all it takes. I mean, our board was not this way before I became chair. We had two women, and the rest were men. And when I became the chair, the CEO and I just looked at each other and we said, it's time. And that's all it took. We did it. And it's because we have the same mindset. And that's what has to happen, is that people need to have this mindset change. And I'm going to say one other thing, and that is, there was a question asked earlier about people with a diverse background and their responsibility. Unfortunately, I have seen people of diverse background, women and men, who are on more boards than I can fathom how they could handle them. And I would say to you that these are not people to be admired, and these are not the people that you should be spending time with, because they are not going to give you any of those opportunities. They seem to have an ability to manage their time so they convince themselves. And you're better off with people who are really committed to getting more women involved or getting more, racial balance.
Great. Well, on that inspirational note, Amy, Dennis, thank you so much. It was wonderful.